Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna, and on behalf of all of us at ForceSpace, thank you for joining us on Facebook and Zoom today for the third episode in a 6-part lunchtime series of presentations and conversations focused on questions of sustainability across disciplines. After today's presentation from Isaac Eckert, the next and final 3 events in this series will take place next week, July 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, also at noon. So check out the full schedule on concordia.ca/4. For now, if you're here joining us on Zoom, welcome. Please do feel free to ask any questions throughout in the Q&A function, and our moderator, Dr. Rebecca Titler, will address them after Isaac's presentation. For those of you following along on the Facebook page, please do share your comments there, and we'll make sure to bring them over here again to be answered after the presentation. It is now my pleasure to invite Jim Grant to provide a brief introduction to today's event and introduce today's presenter. So over to you, Jim.
Great, thanks very much, Anna. And thanks to ForceSpace for hosting this webinar series. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm good. So why am I here, you might ask? Well, I'm representing Loyola College and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. Both these organizations host an annual sustainability conference. Unfortunately, it was canceled due to the pandemic in March 2020. But the good news is we have some of those student speakers from that series to speak to us today in this, Isaac today, and others next week in this webinar series. So that is fantastic. Let's see, before Isaac speaks, let me just introduce 2 people. Dr. Rebecca Titler will be the moderator of this session. Rebecca is the coordinator for both the college and the center. And Dr. Tanya DeBellis is Isaac's supervisor, and she'll introduce the students. So maybe I'll pass it over to Tanya now to introduce Isaac.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting us. So yes, I am kind of supervising Isaac with Dr. Lazard at Concordia University. So just a little bit on Isaac. So he did his BSc at McGill, then joined us in the fall of 2018 and to do his master's. And so he started in September, and in January, we sent him off to Argentina with our other PhD student in the lab, Gabriel, who's also, you'll see his name on this first slide. So we sent them off to Argentina to collect a whole bunch of samples and a bunch of data. And a couple of months later, Isaac came back and he's been analyzing all this stuff, and he's going to present some of what he's learned from this experience to us today. There you go. It's all yours, Isaac.
Sweet. I'll share my screen. All right. Hi, everybody. So I'm obviously Isaac, and today I'm going to give a quick talk about what I study here at Concordia. And so I've titled my talk, Invasive Species, Climate Change and Biodiversity, a focus on Canadian pines in Argentina. And really my goals for this presentation are to give everybody a brief background on what invasive species are and why we should care about them. Then I kind of want to outline my interest in studying invasive species, present some of the results that Tanya briefly mentioned we were working on, and finally talk a bit about what you can do as the average person. So let's jump right into it. Sweet. So to start, and to make sure everyone's on the same page, I just want to define invasive species. So I define an invasive species as any species that's not native to an ecosystem in which it has a tendency to spread or thrive. You see, humans introduce lots of species into ecosystems all around the world, and traditionally these species wouldn't be found there, but not every species has the ability to spread or thrive, and the ones that do are the invasive ones. And some examples of some common invaders are on the slide here, and you might have heard of some of them. The zebra mussel is a huge problem in Quebec and Ontario freshwater lakes, and it's actually native to Russia. The Norway maple is an invasive tree that people often mistake as the maple leaf that belongs on our flag, but it isn't, and it's native to Europe and Asia. And the round goby, finally, has also invaded the Great Lakes region, and it's native to the Black and Caspian Seas. And these are just some examples of some invasives, although there are hundreds that have now invaded ecosystems in Quebec and Ontario. And the truth is, when it comes to ecology and topics in ecology, invasive species actually get a lot of news coverage, and the public is actually fairly well informed about what they do and who they are. Invasive species really blew up as a news topic between 2005 and 2010, largely due in part to Canadians realizing the true extent of this issue. In 2005, a groundbreaking study was published in the States that estimated the environmental losses and damages as a result of invasive species to be around $120 billion annually, which is an insanely high number. In 2006, a Canadian research group followed up this estimate with their own estimate of the annual cost of invasives in Canada, and they estimated that it cost Canadian taxpayers around $13.3 and $13.4 billion annually. And this was back in 2005 and 2006. So since then, this number has definitely increased. And in fact, since the 1970s, the number of invasive species globally has risen over 70%. So clearly, as the title of this slide suggests, invasive species are a major problem, both environmentally and economically. And the truth is, for many ecosystems in Canada, like this ecosystem, which is in Frontenac Park, close to the town I grew up in, invasive species are there and they're living with and in conjunction with native species. So biological communities have gone from, in a large part, from being comprised of entirely natives to now containing at least one, if not many, invasive species. So they've kind of gone from looking like that to looking more like that today. And unfortunately, because of the integration of invasives into a lot of Canadian ecosystems, it's extremely hard to get rid of invasive species once they've established. And so while these invaded ecosystems are for the most part here to stay, the specific assemblage or the community of species in them is constantly changing. And that's really where my interest lies. See, we know invasive species can cause a variety of changes to native communities. Everything from outcompeting natives for valuable resources to fundamentally altering food webs to changing ecosystems from the ground up by altering nutrient cycling. But what we don't really always understand is how a novel species goes and causes all these changes. And while invasive species are present in almost every biome and ecosystem on the planet, I am really only mainly focused on two, the alpine and the tundra biomes. So typically, alpine and tundra biomes are treeless. This is a little fun diagram that I found in a paper I was reading that just illustrates where the tundra and alpine tundra biomes lie. And the reason why they're treeless is because they're usually located above the altitudinal tree line in the case of the alpine, or above or below the latitudinal tree line in the case of the tundra. And because of their lack of trees, these two ecosystems contain a high diversity of smaller plant species, including lots of specialized plants that you won't find growing in forested ecosystems. And in turn, these plants support a unique community of mammals, birds, insects, reptiles, and even amphibians. However, due to the treeless nature of these biomes, they're under threat from both invasive trees that humans introduce, but also from native tree line advance as a result of ambient climate warming. And so as tree lines advance and as these ecosystems suffer biological invasion by novel tree species, we're losing these vulnerable and unique ecosystems. Now, what's really interesting about this problem is that mountains all over the world, here I've listed some, or I've illustrated some major mountain chains all over the world, are facing the same threats and succumbing to the same fates. So whether it's the Rockies here in Canada, the Andes in South America, where we went and did my fieldwork, the Alps in Europe, or the Himalayas in Asia, all mountains are facing changes imposed by climate warming, changes in precipitation, biological invasions, and human habitat disturbance. However, despite the severity of all these threats to the alpine and tundra ecosystems, we still don't really understand how these ecosystems are changing over the short term. And so in order to get to the bottom of this, and really going back to invasive species, because that's what I focused on, I decided to focus my research on understanding how an invasive tree can change an alpine or tundra biome. And in order to study this example, I needed an example of a novel tree actually invading an alpine or tundra biome. And thanks to communication between our lab and JP here at Concordia and Dr. Martin Nunez's lab in Bariloche, Argentina, we found a perfect study site. And here's a photo of it. So interestingly enough, the trees you're seeing in this photo are actually Canadian. So they're the provincial tree of Alberta, or the lodgepole pine. And they've invaded many of the slopes and alpine regions of mountains in the southern hemisphere, especially in the Andes, because that's where a lot of mountains are. And this tree was first introduced to countries like Argentina for forestry, but has since spread from its original plantations into many vulnerable alpine ecosystems like the one you can see in this picture. And luckily for me, this was a perfect example of an invasive species invading a treeless alpine community. And this is the system I chose to use to answer my question. And my question was, how does a single invading tree alter communities in an alpine ecosystem? Really, what are the impacts that a single invasive species can have? And so we went to Argentina with the goal of finding answers, and we studied this invasion. And the first thing we found was that a single novel tree in a typically treeless ecosystem causes a variety of changes, some of which were pretty obvious. Trees have big branches, and in an ecosystem like the alpine, they're much taller than any other plant species, and so they offer a novel source of shade. And we found that this shading reduced ground soil temperatures by over 10 degrees Celsius, which is a drastic change if you're a plant or animal living beneath the tree. Secondly, we found that the large roots used by the tree for stability and water sequestration actually made the soil much more moist. And soils underneath trees had almost double the moisture content compared to soils away from trees. And finally, chemical analysis of these soils revealed that the trees also sequestered phosphorus, lowering the amount of phosphorus available for adjacent plants and animals. So at this point, it was pretty clear to us as researchers that this tree was having a profound impact on the ecosystem, but we still didn't really know which of these abiotic changes would impact the native natural communities there. And so in order to answer that, we actually went and we identified the plants and fungi, living underneath and away from these novel trees. And specifically, we were looking at native communities under older pines, which were what we call adult pines, under younger pines, which we call saplings, or in areas with no pines or uninvaded areas that we call controls. And so what we did was we went and we set up quadrats beneath the tree, which is just a 2 meter by 2 meter area of standard size. And then we identified everything we could find. So the plants were pretty easy, right? Like there are some examples of plants that we identified here in these photos. That's pretty basic, but identifying the fungi was a lot more difficult. See, most of us think of fungi as mushrooms that we eat and we see when we go on hikes. And while that isn't entirely false, it also isn't the whole picture. So most fungi are tiny microscopic organisms living in the soil, on roots, or maybe on leaves, or even in other organisms. And in this case, we were interested in the communities of fungi interacting with plant roots in our quadrat. So in order to ID these fungi, we used a combination of DNA extraction, DNA amplification, and genetic sequencing. And so really what we did was we profiled each taxa, each species of fungi, by a specific sequence in its genome that is what we call a barcode. And then all we had to do was compare these barcodes to online databases, and we'd get a taxonomic match. And then after we had species, we could compare it to other databases and get more information about the fungi, like what type of fungi it was. And specifically, I was interested in the diversity of 2 kinds of fungi. I was interested in symbiotes and pathogens. And these 2 groups of fungi are very important. Symbiotes help plants overcome a variety of environmental stressors, and they likely help these plants persist in harsh environments like the alpine and tundra. But pathogens, on the other hand, are parasitic fungi, and they negatively interact with plants, usually decreasing plant fitness and making it harder for plants to persist. And what we found when we looked at these 2 groups of fungi was that a single pine invading a treeless ecosystem has profound impacts on below-ground fungal communities. So specifically, invading pines are actually decreasing the species richness of fungal symbiotes and increasing the species richness of fungal pathogens. And richness in this case just refers to the total number of species in a community. And you can see the pattern is pretty clear in these figures. So symbiotes on the left shows a pretty clear decrease as you move from control to sapling to pine, whereas pathogens on the right shows a pretty clear and stark increase as you move from control to sapling to pine. And what's even more interesting is that these patterns are being driven by variation in soil moisture and ground temperature, which is 2 of the main effects that we associated with novel pines, right? I just talked about how we saw that novel pines are making the soils more wet and moist and cold. So now we can kind of piece together the whole picture. So when a pine tree establishes in a treeless community, it shades the ground and it traps moisture, creating more wet and cold soils beneath the tree. And in turn, this causes changes in the richness of fungal communities associating with plants that grow next to these novel trees. And specifically, the wetter and colder soils increase the species richness of soil pathogens and decrease the species richness of soil symbionts. And that's pretty cool, but the question still is, what does all this mean for native plants? And we'll remember, pathogens are parasitic, so they negatively impact plant fitness. And while they are important drivers of biodiversity in some systems, pathogens usually work to degrade and infect plants, providing stress and decreasing productivity and reproduction over time. Symbionts, on the other hand, help to work plants overcome environmental stressors, and they can sequester important nutrients, minerals, and water that they share with their plant hosts. They can also defensively fend off herbivores, other fungal pathogens, and other organisms that would damage the plant and its roots. And what we're seeing here is that pines are increasing the diversity of pathogens, which is probably increasing the stress on adjacent plants, while at the same time limiting the plant's ability to combat stress by decreasing symbiont diversity. And so over time, and with the arrival of more and more invading pines, the increase in pathogens and decrease in symbionts is likely going to limit the ability of plants to persist in soils adjacent to invading pines. So of course, over the long term, pine invasions usually end up like this. So this is another photo of an older invasion on a mountain, actually just next to the one in the left in Argentina, the photo was taken by Dr. Martin Nunez, a collaborator of ours. But what's cool is that now we understand the exact mechanism through which a pine invasion goes from the left to the right. So instead of the pine actually just interacting with native plants by shading and trapping moisture, instead this pine is actually having more specific impacts on the actual fungal communities that the plants depend on to persist in these harsh alpine environments. And this is just one of the ways that these pines are actually transforming this alpine biome, and eventually will transform it into a pine forest. And now that we understand this mechanism, we can better predict what this ecosystem will look like down the road. So which plants will be most vulnerable to pine invasion? Which plants are likely to persist through pine invasion? Well, all of these questions now become answerable now that we know the exact mechanism at work here. And it's important to point out that while I focused on plants and fungi for my project, the true impact of novel pines doesn't stop there. So a change in the soil microbiome is likely to resonate through the entire ecological community, potentially even impacting the animals at the top. And this highlights the importance of work like this. We need to understand how and why invasion impacts communities in order to understand what they will look like in the future and what we can do to preserve them now. And unfortunately, this isn't just the case for alpine and tundra ecosystems. This is the case for ecosystems all over the world. So humans are changing ecosystems and ecological communities in so many ways. And until we understand all of these changes, we will be limited in our ability to combat our own impacts. And while conservation efforts might seem to be the responsibility of government officials in many people's eyes, it really is, when it comes to invasive species, up to the average person. And while the average person probably lacks the ability to go into that mountain in Argentina and rip out every pine tree on their own, because there was thousands of them, you do have the power to help scientists and researchers monitor and understand the state of invasive species around us. And one of the best things we can do is become familiar with common invaders in our communities. Being able to identify the native from the non-native gives us both an appreciation for our land and our species, but also makes us let informed decisions. You know, do I want to plant invasive species in my garden? Do I want to own non-native species as pets? In some cases, there are even special monitoring programs. I've listed a few here under the "to report a sighting" header. And these really are in place to monitor the spread of invasives in Canada. And these programs are really cool because the data goes straight to the government, but it also goes to researchers at labs like mine in Concordia that use this data to help track invasives and understand their impact. So it really is important. And finally, the most important thing you can do, which is also the easiest thing to do in my opinion, is just vote. So you can challenge your representatives, whether local, provincial, or federal, to address the environmental problems we're facing today. In the case of invasive species, every level of government is really critical, and it starts all the way at the average person. So I would encourage everyone who's listening and everyone at home to self-educate, become aware, and really think about this issue when they're out, when they're walking around, and when they're looking at nature here in Canada. And so I want to end my presentation today by thanking a variety of people. So I want to thank the Sustainability Across Disciplines Conference in general, but especially Dr. Becca Titler, who made this first ever virtual edition of the conference possible. And I want to thank Fourth Space at Concordia for sorting out the logistics and hosting us. I also want to thank all of my lab mates and my supervisor, Dr. Lessard, who couldn't be here today. And I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Tanya DeBellis, who is really my go-to fungi woman at, I was going to make a horrible joke, it didn't work. I backed out. But she's really my go-to source of fungal knowledge here at Concordia. And she's been a major help to me over the past few months and years even. So I hope you all enjoyed my talk, and I would absolutely love to attempt to answer any questions anybody has.
Thank you so much, Isaac. It was a wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I tend to think about invasive species here, but not about what we're exporting to other places, which is just, yeah, closed-minded of me, obviously. I'll give people a minute to type questions because that takes a little bit of time, but I'll open the floor up to anybody. You can ask questions in the Q&A box, or if you send them in the chat, I'll get them as well. In the meantime, I have a question from Jim Grant, so I'll pass it over to you, Jim.
Great talk, Isaac. I know you're a fungi specialist, but I have a tree question for you. What is the special adaptation you think that these trees have that no other Andean trees have that lets it live in these environments? Any thoughts about it?
Sure. Well, so pine trees in general are notoriously good invaders, and they've been used as a model genus in the past to kind of understand exactly what specific traits allows for invasibility in trees. And so there are pine trees here in Canada that would be horrible at invading, but the lodgepole pine, or the provincial tree of Alberta, which is the one I studied, has a few adaptations that make it really good. The first of which being that it's extremely plastic. So that means that the pine trees that we might see here that are lodgepole pines grow up as these perfectly straight pole-like trees, as you could probably tell by their name, that are super tall. But the lodgepole pines that we see down there are these conformed, dwarfish little trees that have really adapted to living right at the alpine. Another adaptation that makes these trees really good at invading is that they produce a ton of cones. And so some pine trees, like we've all seen, like these gigantic pine cones coming up from the West Coast, right? So some pine trees invest in producing giant cones, or which they're only able to make a few of. But this pine tree, the lodgepole pine, actually makes a ton of very small cones, probably smaller than the size of your fist. And so what that does is it allows its seeds to disperse so much more effectively than any other sort of pine. And that really helps it invade in these conditions. So yeah, there's a few things like that that made it a particularly good invasive. But in the case of most invasives, and especially this one, the best thing that happened to it was the fact that we decided to plant it. So nothing's going to become invasive unless we decide to introduce it somewhere where it hasn't historically lived. And so that's really the main reason why this tree was able to become invasive. But the other things definitely mattered.
All right, I have a couple of questions in the Q&A. One of them is, so what management strategies can be applied? Should people go there and rid them out, or do we, oh, it just disappeared.
That's okay.
Oh, wait. Okay.
I got the
Sorry,
do we
Rebecca,
just have to accept them? It's okay, I got them. Do we just have to accept them, or do we plant some other native species that could compete with them under a warming climate? So what should we do?
So great question. That's one that in invasive ecology, that's always one of the applications that we aim to do, is inform conservation and management strategies. In the case of these pines, there's been a few management strategies, but really only the thing that works is uprooting them and removing them. the problem is that we went to this one mountain in Argentina, and we actually modeled the number of trees on the mountain using satellite images. And we estimated the total number of trees on this one mountain in Argentina, just in that study area that there's a photo of right now that's up, to be, I think it was over 10,000. And so while we were there, we tried to remove some of the, well, we had to remove some of the trees to study them. And we ended up removing 45, probably closer to 60 trees near the end of it. And we felt like we had made an impact, but clearly we hadn't made an impact. So although the main management strategy would just be rip them out and let the native communities sort of recover from this pine legacy that they leave behind, that isn't really feasible for most ecosystems on the planet that have been invaded like pine trees. The same way it isn't feasible to just remove zebra mussels from Lake Ontario, because how would you go about doing that? And so we think coexistence is really the only way forward. And so one of the things that I've thought of is maybe if you like control the density of trees, so you really limit how close pine trees are growing to one another. So maybe you only uproot the ones that are really forming this thicket of pine trees. Maybe then you'll allow for some native species to be able to persist. But that's a great question, and there's a ton of work being focused on that. And yeah, I guess we'll find out in a few years what the best strategy is.
All right, I have a bunch more questions. One of them is, do you think that your findings from alpine tundra ecosystems can be applied to the Arctic tundra ecosystems?
That's another incredible question. This project was kind of formulated in a way that I really hoped we could apply those findings. And so one of the ways we tried to do that is we only looked at the impact of a single tree. And so really the question we had was like, okay, you take a novel tree that doesn't phylogenetically or historically belong in an ecosystem and you plant it there. What is the impact that we can measure, and what is the impact that we can expect to see in native communities? And so I think that because we chose actually a phylogenetically distant tree that doesn't interact with biological taxa on this mountain, what we're really seeing is the impact of the abiotic establishment of trees. And that's why variables like soil moisture and soil temperature are coming out as important drivers of fungal diversity in these systems, because that is the impact of the tree, and those are the impacts that matter. And so in that sense, it's pretty likely that you could kind of take the conclusions and results we found in this study and apply it to other mountains around the world. And it's probably possible that you could apply it to tundra biomes as well. You could easily test this if you went into the tundra and just did like selective watering and selective temperature change studies to kind of manipulate the same sort of conditions we found on our mountain. And then you could test and see whether or not it is the abiotic conditions, and whether or not if you did plant a tree there, you would see some sort of similar result. But I hope it can be applied to tundra ecosystems, because that would be pretty cool and have very far-reaching applications. But yeah, it's always, you have to go out and test it before you can say anything for sure, I think.
I have a few more questions here. One more question. Do the pines allow invasion of novel fungal mutualists or pathogens? So you talked about what was there. Are any of them novel? Can you tell based on your analysis?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, so in order for pines to grow in Argentina, they're inoculated. And what that means is that before we plant the seedlings or saplings in the ground, we actually expose their roots to kind of a slurry of fungal symbiotes that we curate. And these fungal symbiotes are usually fungi from the pine's native habitat in the Rockies. And so in this case, this pine invasion is a classic example of co-invasion. And so really the pine is entirely dependent on this co-invasive fungal mutualist that we also introduced. But the mutualist is also dependent on the pine. And so they're kind of co-invading together. Yeah, and in this case, with this invasion, we really only found evidence that it required a single below ground mutualist. And it's pretty fun because you can walk around and you see these giant mushrooms growing in, like, we found one, I think not long after taking this photo. And that is the below ground fungal mutualist. It's just the mushroom fruiting body of that fungi. And what's cool is that the people that live in Argentina have actually taken to eating and growing and farming this mushroom because it's really tasty. We don't eat it here in Canada, probably because it's not common enough, but it is a seriously delicious mushroom. And so it's kind of also provided this strange like pine associated economy down there as well. So it's just another example of a weird impact that this invasive species has / requires that you might not think about when you think about like classical invasions.
Okay, I have to ask a question. Sorry. So I get how the pine got there, right? We planted it as a plantation tree. It's a great plantation tree because it grows fast. It grows super straight here, at least. And then pines they have lots of cones, and the pollen is wind dispersed, right? So easy. I get that. How did the mutualist fungus get there?
Yeah, so good question. And so the fungus was actually introduced on the roots of the pine when we planted it. And then, but what's interesting is that, so now a big question regarding this species in Argentina has been, okay, well, does the pine or the mutualist kind of limit the spread of this species, right? Because one has to. And so there's been a few really cool papers that have actually shown that it's the mutualist that limits. So if you plant a seedling of this pine that you haven't inoculated to any below ground mutualist from its native range in an environment like this alpine environment in Argentina, and there are no mutualist spores available to it in the soil, it'll die. And if it doesn't die, it definitely won't reach sexual maturity and be able to reproduce and spread further. And so it really is, this pine invasion is limited by the dispersal ability of the fungi that we introduced on its roots. Luckily for this pine, fungi are incredible dispersers because their spores can be dispersed by animals, by like water, by wind. And so the spores really do get everywhere. And so while it is limiting the pine invasion in this case, it's not a huge limiting factor. It clearly has enabled the pines to invade ecosystems that we might not have expected, considering they're on the top of this mountain.
So that's an argument for planting seeds of non-native species instead of actual plants of non-native seeds.
Yes.
If we're going to limit the possibilities. Okay, so I have some more questions here. Have the lodgepole pines also only invaded the Andes, or also mountains across the planet?
So
they're a situation that's unique.
Yeah, they're global invaders. So they've invaded everywhere from Europe to Africa to South America to they're a crazy big problem in New Zealand. And yeah, so they're absolutely global invaders. And that's one of the reasons why they're such a popular taxa to study when you're studying invasives. What's cool is that they've had variable impacts. And so the pines that have been introduced and have gone invasive in Europe are a lot less threatening because Europe has some evolutionary related cousins of this pine species. And so the pines are a lot less of a threat to European taxa compared to Argentine taxa or South African taxa or something. Probably the worst invaded country by this pine by like percent coverage would be New Zealand, because really when you're driving through like roads on the South Island and you're in a forest and you're like, wow, this is a beautiful pine forest. It's like you're driving through Canada, except all of the trees don't belong there. So it's a pretty, like, I remember when I went, I was like, this is absolutely beautiful. And then I had to stop myself, remember, wait a second, this is a bad thing. These trees aren't supposed to be here. That New Zealand's supposed to have its own trees. But yes, it is very much a global invader.
Okay, so a couple more questions. Is there any hope that we'll be successful in eradicating these invasions? Will they'll just continue to come back?
Yeah, so there is hope for eradication, but for the most part, that's a bit of a fantasy, especially when it comes to trees like this pine, because so the trees that we found were around, a meter, maybe 2 meters tall, the tallest one, which is not big for a tree. That's something we could cut down with like a bad saw that we bought at their version of Home Depot. But what's really the main issue is the root systems that they leave behind. And so some of the roots on these pines were 15, 20 meters long and thicker than the actual tree themselves. Because the soils are so dry and loose up there, they really need giant roots to establish and remain in place. And so there's been a bunch of studies that have shown that if you just cut down the tree, that's great, because you might limit the spread of the invasion. But what you're not doing is actually limiting is actually kind of helping the natives, because what's going on is it's leaving this pretty stark below ground legacy. And that is made possible by the roots remaining in the soil, but it's also made possible because the trees have fundamentally altered soil conditions. And that alteration that they've caused within their lives will last on for 10, 20, even 30 years sometimes. And so management of this species is particularly tricky, but I would say I would be most hopeful for limiting the spread of future invasions, and kind of where they've already invaded, not sacrificing those ecosystems to pine invasion, but trying to manage the density of pines. And so hoping that if we keep pines from forming this thick pine forest, that maybe native species will be able to coexist with the pines in some manner. But you're obviously going to lose some taxa that are particularly susceptible to pine invasion.
Okay, so the pines first got there because they were planted in plantations, so we should tell everyone not to plant lodgepole pine plantations. Right?
Well, kind of. So actually, that was a bit of a lie. So
Okay.
this pine has been introduced to Argentina and countries all around the world for forestry, and we drove past tons of plantations growing this pine for lumber. But the pines on this mountain, so the pines you can see in this photo and the ones that we studied, were actually introduced by the local mayor of the town, because this is a very popular hiking destination for Argentine tourists when they go and try to escape the giant city that is Buenos Aires. And so they'll come here and they'll want beautiful hiking trails. And one year, back in the 1970s, this mountain caught fire, and the entire slope of the mountain facing the city totally burned down. And it was this gigantic like scar, right? And in this very touristic setting, the mayor decided that they couldn't have this scar on the mountain. And so he actually enlisted school children as like a school program to go out and plant these pine saplings. And so a bunch of school classes from the town all went and worked to plant these trees to kind of reforest this destroyed mountain to make it scenic again for tourists. And those are the trees that have since spread. And so in many invasions, you can trace back all the invasive species to a single or a few plantations. But in this case, it's a lot harder to, because there were school children in charge of planting these trees, and there were, people who aren't trained in forestry in charge of looking after these school children. And so it's very likely that these trees were just planted all over the mountain. But yeah, so this is just another example of how an invasive species could come to be established. It's not always economic. Well, I guess this is economic because they want tourists, but it's not always purely like industry based. In this case, it was a mayor that was like, we want the mountain to be beautiful again. And so he planted a bunch of trees using school kids.
That's a crazy story. When did that happen?
In the late 1970s.
Oh God. Okay. Okay. Maybe we'll end there since we're already over time. I'm so sorry, but there were lots of questions. Everybody has lots of questions. Thank you for this great presentation, Isaac. I learned a lot. I'm sure I speak for our whole audience, almost all of whom stuck around for the extra time. So you're obviously enthralling. Good luck with the rest of your research. Thank you to everybody, to all of those of you who came as audience members to participate, to ask questions. Thank you to the Force Space, to Anna and Vanessa and Hannah and Doug for all of your support, to Jim for the support of the Research Center, for Tonya to being here, and especially to you, Isaac, for presenting your work. I'd like to also give a little plug for next week. On Tuesday, we have Mera Parali, who's the next speaker in this series. She'll present at noon on Tuesday next week, and she'll talk about measuring and monitoring urban sprawl. So I hope that you can join us for that one. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting as well. Thanks a lot, everyone. I'll hand it over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for that shout out. Really nice of you. Thank you, Isaac. Wow, that was fantastic. And, I speak only for myself, but I really appreciated the fungi joke attempt. So thanks for that. On behalf of all of us at ForSpace, I'd like to thank you for being here, especially Jim, Tanya, and Rebecca. Thank you for moderating today's event once again. So Rebecca already reminded you of the schedule next week, July 21st, 22nd, and 23rd at noon. You can check out the full schedule on concordia.ca/4, where a recording of this video will also live very soon in our archive. And of course, it's also available on Facebook if you want to check it out there at CU ForSpace and share it, comment on it further. I'm sure Isaac would be happy to continue the conversation. On that note, thanks everybody. Have a great lunch. We appreciate your participation and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.